The rain hit the diner window like static on an old television, and Daniel Reyes didn't look up from his coffee when the bell above the door rang for the 20th time that hour. He didn't need to. He knew every sound in this place by heart: the hiss of the fryer, the squeak of Booth 4's vinyl seat, the way Marla always dropped the silverware bin a little too hard when her feet hurt. This was his corner. His Tuesday. His quiet. So when a shadow fell across his table and a voice asked, "Can I sit with you?" he assumed it was Marla, telling him his shift started in 10 minutes. It wasn't Marla. It was Vivian Cross. The Vivian Cross. The one whose face had been on the cover of a business magazine Daniel had glanced at in a waiting room 2 years ago. The one who ran a foundation with her name stitched onto hospital wings and university buildings across 3 states. The one who, according to every rumor swirling through this town for the last 6 months, was here to decide whether the local plant, the one that employed half the block, including Daniel, would stay open or shut its doors for good. She was standing in a $200 raincoat, dripping onto the linoleum of a diner that smelled like burnt coffee and bacon grease, looking at him like she already knew him. "I'm sorry?" Daniel said. "You heard me," she said, and there was something strange in her voice, not the polished, practiced tone from the magazine interview, but something raw. Almost nervous. "Can I sit with you, Daniel?" He hadn't told her his name. Outside, thunder rolled low over the town, and somewhere behind the counter, a coffee cup shattered on the floor. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had made any sense yet, and Daniel Reyes was still just a man trying to get his daughter to school on time. Daniel Reyes was 41 years old, and if you passed him on the street, you would not look twice. He wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation, all a little faded, all missing at least one button he kept meaning to replace. He drove a 14-year-old pickup truck with a check engine light that had been on so long he'd stopped noticing it. He worked the maintenance crew at Holbrook Manufacturing, the town's largest employer, fixing conveyor belts and patching leaky pipes for $18 an hour. He was quiet. Almost aggressively quiet. The kind of man who said morning to his coworkers and then didn't say another unnecessary word for the rest of the shift. Some people mistook that quiet for simplicity. They were wrong, but Daniel never bothered correcting them. Correcting people took energy, and energy was something he budgeted carefully these days, like everything else in his life. He had a daughter, Emma, who was 8 years old and the only thing in the world that made him feel like his chest wasn't full of gravel. Emma's mother had died 3 years ago. Complications during a routine surgery, the kind of thing that isn't supposed to happen, the kind of thing that leaves you standing in a hospital hallway holding a stranger's hand because you don't know what else to do with your own. Daniel didn't talk about it. He didn't talk about a lot of things. What people in town didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that before Holbrook Manufacturing, before the flannel shirts and the 14-year-old truck, Daniel Reyes had been someone else entirely. He'd spent 12 years as a mechanical engineer, the kind who designed systems for companies most people had heard of. He'd walked away from all of it after his wife died, because staying in that world meant 60-hour weeks and a nanny raising his daughter, and he wasn't willing to let that happen. So he took a job that let him be home by 5 every day. A job that didn't ask too much of the part of him that was still healing. Nobody at Holbrook knew that. To them, Daniel Reyes was just the maintenance guy. Quiet. Reliable. Forgettable. And that suited him fine until Roger Callahan became floor supervisor. Roger was the kind of man who'd never built anything in his life but had strong opinions about everyone who did. He'd gotten the supervisor job through his brother-in-law, who sat on the plant's regional board, and he wore his authority like a costume that didn't quite fit, loud, showy, always looking for someone smaller to make himself feel bigger. He'd taken an instant dislike to Daniel. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the fact that Daniel never laughed at Roger's jokes, never flinched when Roger raised his voice, never gave him the reaction he was fishing for. Whatever it was, Roger had decided early on that Daniel Reyes was a problem to be managed. The stakes were simple, and they were everything. Daniel needed this job. Not because he couldn't find another, he probably could, but because Emma's school was 2 minutes from the plant, because her after-school program let him pick her up by 5:15, because every piece of their fragile little routine was built around this specific address. Losing it meant unraveling months of careful stability he'd built for a little girl who'd already lost too much. So Daniel kept his head down. He showed up early. He fixed what was broken. And he let Roger Callahan believe whatever he wanted to believe about him. The trouble started small, the way trouble usually does. It was a Tuesday morning when Roger called a floor meeting and singled Daniel out in front of 11 other workers. "Reyes here took 40 minutes on the number 3 conveyor yesterday," Roger said, arms crossed, voice pitched to Carrie. 40 minutes. My nephew could have fixed that in 15. Daniel didn't argue. The truth was the belt's tensioning system had been rigged with a bootleg part someone installed years before Daniel ever started, and fixing it properly, instead of just slapping another patch on it, had taken exactly as long as it needed to. But explaining that would have meant a conversation, and conversations with Roger had a way of turning into performances. "I'll pick up the pace," Daniel said. "See that you do." Roger smiled like he'd won something. A week later, it was the schedule. Roger posted the new shift rotation, and Daniel found himself assigned to the late shift 3 days running, the one that ended at 7 p.m., an hour and 45 minutes after Emma's after-school program closed. Daniel approached him carefully. "Roger, I've got a daughter. I need to be out by 5. Roger didn't even look up from his clipboard. "Everybody's got something, Reyes. Figure it out." Daniel figured it out. He called in a favor from Marla at the diner, who agreed to pick Emma up and let her do homework in a back booth until Daniel's shift ended. It cost him $15 a day he didn't have to spare, and it cost him something else too, the quiet dread of a man watching his careful arrangements come apart thread by thread, with no one seeming to notice or care. The third incident was smaller, but it was the one that stuck with him longest. There was a young guy on the floor named Pete Alvarez, 23, sweet-natured, still learning the ropes, the kind of kid who said yes sir to everyone including men his own age. Pete had a stutter that got worse when he was nervous, and Roger had clearly identified this as entertainment. "Spit it out, Alvarez," Roger said one afternoon, when Pete was trying to report a jammed hydraulic line. The floor went quiet. Pete's ears went red. He tried again, stumbled over the word pressure, and Roger laughed, an ugly, performative laugh meant to be heard. "PP pressure," Roger mimicked. "We got ourselves a poet." Nobody laughed with him. But nobody stopped him either. Daniel watched Pete's face crumble in on itself, watched him mutter something and hurry off toward the supply room, and something old and controlled inside Daniel's chest pulled tight. He found Pete 20 minutes later, sitting on an overturned crate behind the supply shelves, not quite crying but close to it. "He does that to everybody eventually," Daniel said, not making a big thing of it, just sitting down on the crate beside him. "I hate it," Pete said. "I hate that I let him get to me." "You're not letting him do anything. He's choosing to be cruel. That's on him, not you." Daniel handed him a bottle of water from his own bag. "You're better at this job than he'll ever know. Hydraulic lines fixed, right?" Pete blinked. "Yeah. I fixed it before he even said anything." Then he wasn't laughing at incompetence. He was laughing because it made him feel big. Don't hand him that kind of power over how you see yourself. It wasn't a speech. Daniel didn't do speeches. But something about the way he said it, steady, sure, like a man who'd thought carefully about exactly this kind of cruelty before, made Pete look at him a little differently after that. It was one of the first cracks in the quiet, unremarkable version of Daniel Reyes that everyone assumed was the whole picture. The other crack came 2 days later, when the plant's backup generator failed during a storm and every engineer Halbrook called in from the corporate office spent 4 hours staring at wiring diagrams with increasingly panicked expressions. Daniel walked in, looked at the control panel for 90 seconds, and rerouted the failsafe himself using terminology that made one of the corporate engineers stop and stare at him. "Where'd you learn to do that?" the engineer asked. "Read a lot," Daniel said, and went back to work before anyone could ask a follow-up question. Roger heard about it secondhand and didn't like it. He didn't like anything that made Daniel look competent, because competence made him harder to dismiss, and dismissing Daniel was the closest thing Roger had to a hobby. So Roger escalated. He started writing Daniel up for things that weren't infractions, 5 minutes late when the time clock itself was known to run fast, an improper uniform citation for a scuffed boot. Small, petty, deliberate. The kind of paper trail a man builds when he's decided he wants someone gone and needs to make it look procedural. "You're building a case against me," Daniel said quietly, the day Roger handed him his third write-up in 2 weeks. "I'm just doing my job, Reyes." Roger's smile was thin. "Maybe you should focus on doing yours." Daniel took the write-up without another word and folded it into his jacket pocket. That night, after Emma was asleep, he sat at the kitchen table for a long time, staring at nothing, doing the math on how many more write-ups it would take before doing his job turned into grounds for termination. He thought about updating his resume. He thought about the version of himself that used to sit in boardrooms, the one who could have made a call and had this entire situation handled in an afternoon. He thought about how tired he was of being underestimated on purpose, by a man who'd never once asked what Daniel actually knew. But mostly he thought about Emma, asleep down the hall, and how she deserved a father who didn't fold every time someone with a little authority decided to be cruel. He didn't fold. But he didn't fight back either, not yet. He just kept his head down, kept fixing things, kept picking Emma up whenever he could manage it, and kept quietly, carefully surviving. What he didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, was that the woman who owned the majority stake in Holbrook Manufacturing had been watching this plant's numbers for months, preparing to visit in person for the first time in years. And she had a reason for choosing this particular plant, in this particular town, that had nothing to do with production quotas. Vivian Cross had built her foundation on a promise she'd made to herself 15 years ago, in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and fear. Her younger brother, Thomas, had been sick for a long time, the kind of illness that drains a family's savings long before it drains anything else. Their parents had been ordinary people, a schoolteacher and a mechanic, and they'd done everything right and still ended up drowning in medical debt with a dying son and a stack of bills that multiplied faster than they could work. What saved them, in the end, wasn't a miracle. It was an anonymous donor. Someone Vivian never learned who had quietly paid off the family's most crushing debts during the worst 18 months of their lives. Not through some official charity with a name and a gala. Just wire transfers, unmarked, arriving exactly when they were needed most, along with occasional notes that said nothing more than "keep going and you're not alone in this." Thomas didn't survive. But the family did. And the strange, quiet grace of that anonymous kindness had shaped everything Vivian did afterward. She built her fortune in logistics and manufacturing over the following decade, and the moment she had money to spare, she started doing exactly what had once been done for her family, funding people anonymously, no names attached, no strings, no publicity. Medical bills. Mortgage payments. College tuition for kids who'd lost a parent. She ran it through a foundation with layers of anonymity so thick that even her own board didn't know the full extent of the individual gifts. One of those gifts, 7 years ago, had gone to a young engineer whose wife needed emergency surgery their insurance had denied. Vivian's foundation had covered it in full, through a chain of paperwork that carried no name back to her. She'd never met the man. She only remembered the case because of a detail in the file that had stayed with her. The engineer had written back, through the foundation's contact form, a single unprompted message: "I don't know who you are, but because of you, my daughter still has her mother tonight. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of person who deserves that." Vivian had kept that message. She still had it, actually, saved somewhere she didn't like to admit she checked more often than made sense. She hadn't come to this town to find him. She'd come because Holbrook Manufacturing, a company she'd quietly held a controlling stake in for 3 years through a holding company, was flagged for review, declining morale, rising turnover, an unusual number of formal complaints filed against a single floor supervisor named Roger Callahan. Her operations team recommended either a leadership change or a plant closure. She wanted to see it herself before deciding which. She arrived without warning, without an entourage, dressed down enough that nobody at the diner across from the plant recognized her when she walked in for coffee on her first morning in town. That's where she saw him. He was sitting alone in a corner booth, in a faded flannel shirt with a missing button, nursing a coffee like it was the only luxury he allowed himself. Something about his face made her stop. She didn't recognize him, not exactly. It had been 7 years, and the man in that old file photo had been younger, sharper around the edges, before grief had worn certain lines into him. But something about the stillness of him, the careful, contained way he held himself, snagged at a memory she couldn't quite place. She almost walked past. She told herself later that some instinct stopped her, the kind of instinct she'd learned to trust in boardrooms, the kind that had made her a fortune. She asked Marla, quietly, who he was. "That's Daniel," Marla said. "Daniel Reyes. Works over at Holbrook. Good man. Raises his little girl on his own, lost his wife a few years back." She paused, wiping down the counter. "Quiet fella. Doesn't say much, but he's the first person here if you need help with something." Reyes. Vivian felt something cold move through her chest. She excused herself, went out to her car, and pulled up the old file on her phone with hands that weren't quite steady. The name matched. The timeline matched. The daughter's age matched. The man in the corner booth, the maintenance worker at the plant she was here to evaluate, was the same man whose message she'd kept in her private files for 7 years. The man who'd promised to spend his life becoming someone who deserved what had been given to him. She sat in her car for 20 minutes before she went back inside. Vivian spent the next several days at the plant under a different name. Vivian Cross was known enough in business circles that she used her middle name, Vivian Marsh, and told the front office she was a consultant conducting an operations review. Nobody questioned it. Corporates sent consultants all the time. What she witnessed in those days confirmed everything the complaint reports had suggested, and then some. She watched Roger Callahan berate a 19-year-old for a mistake that was actually a training gap, never once taking responsibility for the fact that nobody had trained him properly. She watched him take credit, in a meeting with regional management, for a process improvement that 3 separate floor workers quietly told her had actually come from Daniel Reyes. She watched Daniel himself, closer than she let on. She saw him stay 20 minutes late without complaint to help a struggling coworker finish an inventory count so the man wouldn't get written up. She saw him hand Pete Alvarez, the young stuttering worker, a granola bar without a word one afternoon when Pete's face looked pale and shaky. She found out later Pete sometimes skipped lunch to save gas money, and Daniel had apparently noticed weeks before anyone else did. And she saw Roger's write-ups. 3 of them, in Daniel's personnel file, each one thinner than tissue paper in terms of actual justification. She recognized the pattern instantly. She'd seen men like Roger before, small men who mistook cruelty for authority, who needed someone quiet to push against because pushing against someone who might push back required actual courage. The gut punch moment, for her, came on a Thursday. She was in the break room, unnoticed in her consultant blazer, when she overheard Roger cornering Pete Alvarez again, this time over a supply order Pete had filled out correctly, but which Roger had decided to nitpick for sport. "You know what your problem is, Alvarez?" Roger said, voice dropping into the kind of quiet that's worse than shouting. "Everybody feels sorry for you." The stutter, the sad little face. "That's the only reason you still have a job here." Pete's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and that silence, the practiced, defeated silence of someone who'd learned that fighting back only made it worse, was the thing that finally cracked something open in Vivian's chest. It reminded her too much of hospital hallways. Of feeling powerless in front of people who held all the leverage. She found Daniel in the supply room 20 minutes later. He was alone, tightening a bolt on a shelving unit, and he glanced up when she entered with the same neutral politeness he showed everyone. "You're the consultant," he said. "Vivian Marsh, right?" "That's right." She studied him for a moment. "Can I ask you something?" "Off the record." "Sure." "Why do you stay?" "A man like you, I've seen your work. That generator fix last week, the process changes on line 2 that everyone credits to Callahan but clearly weren't his idea. You could work anywhere. Why stay somewhere you're treated like this?" Daniel was quiet for a moment, considering the question honestly instead of brushing it off. "My daughter's school is 2 minutes from here," he said finally. "Her whole life is built around this address, her friends, her routine, the rhythm of things. I could probably find a job that pays better or respects me more. But I already took enough away from her when her mother died. I'm not going to take away the parts of her life that still feel stable, just because my pride's a little bruised. He tightened the last bolt. Besides, Roger's noise. Noise doesn't actually hurt you unless you let it define you. Vivian didn't say anything for a long moment. She was thinking about a message saved on her phone. 7 years old, I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of person who deserves that. That's a good way to look at it, she finally said. It's the only way that gets me through the day, Daniel said, and went back to work. Vivian left the plant that afternoon, drove to her hotel, and sat with her laptop open for 2 hours without typing anything. She had a decision to make, several decisions, actually, and none of them were simple anymore. The reveal didn't happen the way Vivian had planned it, if she'd planned anything at all. It happened because Roger Callahan, sensing an opportunity to look decisive in front of a corporate consultant, decided to make an example of Daniel in front of her. It was a Friday afternoon. The plant floor was busy, everyone finishing up before the weekend, when Roger called a floor meeting with Vivian, still Vivian Marsh as far as he knew, standing at the back to observe. I want to use this as a teaching moment, Roger announced to the assembled workers, holding up a clipboard with visible relish. Reyes here has accumulated 3 write-ups in a month. Chronic tardiness, uniform violations, insubordination. This is what happens when standards slip. I'm recommending termination, effective today. The floor went silent. Pete Alvarez's face went white. Even the workers who didn't know Daniel well seemed to sense that something was wrong with this. The write-ups, if you actually read them, amounted to nothing. Daniel didn't argue. He'd learned that arguing with Roger in public only gave him more of a stage. He simply nodded once, began removing his work gloves, and said, "Understood." That was the moment Vivian stepped forward. "Actually," she said, and something in her voice had changed, steadier now, colder, carrying the particular authority of someone used to boardrooms, not consulting reports. "I'd like to see those write-ups myself before anything is finalized." Roger, mildly annoyed but not yet alarmed, handed them over. Vivian read through them slowly, deliberately, in front of the entire floor. "This first one cites a 40-minute repair time on a conveyor belt," she said. "I pulled the maintenance logs this week. That conveyor had a non-standard part installed before Mr. Reyes was even employed here. 40 minutes to diagnose and properly repair a hidden fault is, frankly, fast." She turned a page. "This one cites a uniform violation for a scuffed boot. I'd like to know what policy defines acceptable boot condition, because I couldn't find one in the employee handbook." Another page. "And this one, insubordination, appears to document Mr. Reyes calmly explaining that he has childcare obligations." "That's not insubordination. That's a man asking for reasonable accommodation." Roger's face had gone from annoyed to uncertain. "Now, hold on, I'm not finished," Vivian said. "I've spent this week watching how this floor actually runs. I've watched Daniel Reyes solve problems your engineers from corporate couldn't solve in 4 hours. I've watched him mentor a young employee you've spent weeks humiliating in front of his peers. And I've watched you take credit, in a regional meeting, for a process change that 3 separate people independently told me came from him." "Who exactly are you to my name?" Vivian said, and there was no performance left in her voice, just plain fact. "Is Vivian Cross. I own the controlling interest in this facility. I've been reviewing this plant under a different name for the past week because the complaint patterns coming out of here concerned me enough to see them firsthand." The silence that followed had weight to it. Somewhere near the back, someone's wrench clattered to the concrete floor. Roger's mouth opened and closed. "Miss Cross, I had no idea. If you'd told me who you were, I would have." "That's exactly the problem," Vivian said. "You would have behaved differently if you'd known someone important was watching. That tells me everything about what kind of supervisor you actually are." She turned toward Daniel, and something in her expression softened, just slightly. "Mr. Reyes, do you remember, about 7 years ago, sending a message through a foundation's contact page? About your wife's surgery?" Daniel's careful composure finally cracked, just a flicker of confusion, then dawning disbelief. That was your foundation? It was mine, Vivian said quietly. I never knew your name attached to a face until I sat across from you in a diner a week ago. I kept your message for 7 years, Daniel. You said you'd spend your life trying to be the kind of person who deserved what was given to you. She looked around at the plant floor, at Pete Alvarez's stunned face, at the coworkers Daniel had quietly helped without ever asking for recognition. I think you've more than kept that promise. Roger, sensing the ground shifting beneath him in ways he was only beginning to understand, tried one more time. Ms. Cross, I run a tight floor. Standards matter. If I've been hard on Reyes, it's because he was quiet, and didn't fight back, and made an easy target, Vivian said. I've read your complaint file, Mr. Callahan. 11 formal complaints in 18 months. I should have visited this plant a long time ago. What happened next didn't unfold the way a movie might have staged it, no immediate, satisfying explosion of consequences delivered on the spot. Vivian Cross was too careful a businesswoman for that, and the situation was more layered than a simple villain gets fired story. She launched a full review of Roger's tenure as supervisor over the following 2 weeks, working with HR and pulling records, interviews, and documentation from every worker on the floor, not just Daniel. What emerged was a clear pattern. Roger had built a small fiefdom of favoritism and fear, rewarding workers who flattered him and punishing those who didn't, taking credit where it wasn't earned and deflecting blame where it was. The decision to terminate him wasn't about the single incident with Daniel. It was about the pattern, 18 months of it, documented and undeniable. But Vivian was careful, too, about drawing the line between Roger and the handful of workers who'd gone along with his behavior out of fear rather than cruelty. There was a shift lead, a woman named Carol, who'd occasionally laughed along at Roger's jokes at Pete's expense, not because she found them funny, Vivian learned, but because she was a single mother herself, terrified of losing her position if she pushed back against a supervisor with connections to the regional board. When Vivian met with Carol privately, she didn't fire her. She asked her one question: if Roger were gone tomorrow, and you didn't have to worry about your job, would you have done anything differently? Carol had cried, actually cried, and said, every single day. I hated myself every time I laughed at something that wasn't funny. Then you already know what kind of person you want to be, Vivian said. I'm not interested in punishing fear. I'm interested in giving people room to be brave. You'll get that room now. What you do with it is up to you. Carol became, in the months that followed, one of the floor's strongest advocates for the newer and younger workers, the kind of quiet redemption that never made headlines but mattered enormously to the people who worked beside her. Roger, for his part, was terminated with cause. He tried, briefly, to argue that the write-ups against Daniel were legitimate performance management, but the documentation didn't hold up, and Vivian had no interest in giving him a graceful exit. He left the plant on a Tuesday morning, carrying a cardboard box, and nobody on the floor said goodbye. The plant didn't close. That much became clear within the month. Vivian restructured the leadership, promoted a new floor supervisor from within, a woman named Denise who'd spent 9 years on the floor and understood the machinery and the people in equal measure, and invested in the equipment upgrades the plant had needed for years. Daniel was offered a promotion, not maintenance lead, but a newly created position overseeing engineering improvements across 3 regional plants, a role that used the 12 years of experience he'd buried under flannel shirts and quiet Tuesdays. The salary alone would have changed his and Emma's life. But what mattered more to him was the flexibility built into the role, negotiated specifically so he'd never again have to choose between his daughter and his paycheck. He hesitated before accepting it. Not because he didn't want it, he did, more than he'd let himself admit in years, but because something in him still flinched at visibility, at being seen. 7 years of quiet had become a kind of armor. Vivian found him on the plant floor the evening after she made the offer, staying late again, fixing something that wasn't technically his responsibility anymore. You don't have to decide tonight, she said. I know. He set down his wrench. Can I ask you something? Why me? You could have just fixed the plant and moved on. You didn't have to tell me who you were. You didn't have to tell anyone what you did for us back then. Vivian considered the question for a long moment. Someone did something quiet and kind for my family once, a long time ago, when we had nothing left. I never got to say thank you to them, because they never told us who they were. I've spent 15 years trying to be that for other people, without ever expecting anything back. She looked out at the empty floor, the machines quiet for the night. But I think part of me always hoped that someday, one of the people I helped would turn out to be someone worth knowing. Someone who took what was given to them and turned it into something good, instead of just surviving on it. You did that. You didn't just survive what happened to your family, you became someone who protects other people going through hard things. That's rare. I wanted to see it up close. Daniel didn't have a ready answer for that. He just nodded, and something loosened in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He took the promotion 2 days later. Pete Alvarez kept his job, of course, and something shifted in him once Roger was gone. The stutter didn't disappear, but the constant tension that made it worse seemed to ease. 6 months later, he was training new hires himself, patient in a way that suggested he remembered exactly what it felt like to be the person struggling to get a sentence out under pressure. Daniel made sure of that, actually quietly recommended Pete for the training role, the same way he'd quietly handed him a granola bar months before. He never made a show of it. That wasn't who he was, and becoming someone with more authority hadn't changed that. If anything, it made him more careful about how he used it. Emma, for her part, noticed her father coming home a little lighter these days. He still worked harder, in some ways, in the new role, but he made it to her school plays now with time to spare, and on Sundays, they drove to the lake because he actually had the energy for it. One evening, months after everything had settled, Emma asked him about the woman who'd come to his work and made everything better, as she put it, in the simplified version of the story she'd pieced together. Daniel thought about how to explain it to an 8-year-old: the debt, the years of quiet struggle, the strange grace of an anonymous kindness returning at exactly the moment it was needed most. A long time ago, he said, someone helped us when we needed it most, and we never knew who they were. Years later, it turned out that same person needed to see that her kindness had gone somewhere good. That it hadn't been wasted. Did it? Emma asked. Go somewhere good? Daniel looked at his daughter, steady, curious, growing up in a life that finally felt solid under her feet again, and thought about Pete Alvarez training new hires with more patience than anyone had ever shown him. About Carol, finding her courage a little more each day. About a plant full of people who no longer flinched when a supervisor walked by. I think so, he said. I think it went exactly where it was supposed to. Vivian visited the plant occasionally after that, never with fanfare, sometimes still slipping into the diner across the street for coffee, where Marla had started saving her a seat at the counter without being asked. She and Daniel became something like friends, not dramatic, not complicated, just two people who understood, in a way most others couldn't, what it meant to carry weight quietly and keep choosing kindness anyway. She never turned the story into a headline for her foundation, never used it to burnish her image. That wasn't the point, and both of them knew it. Some kindnesses aren't meant to be loud. They're meant to be planted quietly, and trusted to grow on their own time, in places you may never get to see until, if you're lucky, one rainy afternoon, they sit down across from you in a diner booth, and you finally understand exactly what you helped build.